Hey everybody. Today I want to give you an overview into the endocrine system. What is the endocrine system? What does it do? And how does it do it in general? Well, the endocrine system is a collection of glands that are going to produce chemical messengers that we call hormones. And then those hormones are going to be released into the fluids of the body, the interstitial fluid in the blood, and they're going to travel and they're going to act on target cells. And they're going to elicit physiological effects in those specific target cells. And some of the processes that the endocrine system, that these hormones are going to be involved in regulating, include processes such as growth, metabolism, circadian rhythms, which is our 24-hour sleep-wake cycles, water and electrolyte balance, blood sugar, reproduction, as well as the stress response, both short and long-term stress. So now what I want to do is go through some of these specific endocrine glands and talk about which of these endocrine processes they're involved in regulating. And let's start with the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland is located right beneath the larynx or the voice box, and it wraps around your trachea or your windpipe. So what hormone does the thyroid gland produce, and what is that hormone going to regulate? Well, the thyroid gland is going to produce thyroid hormone. And thyroid hormone is going to act on virtually every cell of the body. And what it does is it's going to stimulate cellular respiration. It's going to stimulate the conversion of glucose into ATP, which is the chemical form of energy that the cells use. And so the thyroid gland is involved in metabolism. And in fact, thyroid hormone is our body's major metabolic hormone. What about the pancreas? This is the pancreas here, down in the abdominal cavity. And the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum, wraps around the head of the pancreas like so. So what hormones is the pancreas going to produce, and what are they involved in regulating? Well, the pancreas is going to produce the hormones insulin and glucagon. And those hormones are responsible for regulating blood sugar. So the pancreas is responsible for regulating blood sugar. What about the adrenal glands? We have two adrenal glands, one located on top of each kidney. Well, the adrenal glands actually have two different parts to it. They have an inner medulla region and they have an outer cortex region. And both of those are going to produce different hormones that are involved in different things. But overall, the adrenal gland is going to be involved in the stress response. It's going to release the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are going to regulate the short-term stress response. And then it's going to release the hormones cortisol and aldosterone, which are going to regulate the long-term stress response. The adrenal gland is also going to be involved in water and electrolyte balance, maintaining the balance of water and electrolytes like sodium in the blood. Then we have the pineal gland, and this is the pineal gland up here in the brain. Does anybody know what hormone the pineal gland is going to produce? Well, the pineal gland is going to produce the hormone melatonin. And it's going to do this in response to darkness. So melatonin is going to be released by the pineal gland at night. And this hormone is going to be responsible for regulating our circadian rhythms, our 24-hour sleep-wake cycles. What about the liver? The liver isn't often thought of as an endocrine organ, but it's going to produce a pretty important hormone. So I'll try to draw that in here. The liver is located in the upper right quadrant, for the most part, of the abdomen. And the liver is going to produce a hormone called insulin-like growth factor, or IGF. And IGF is going to act on the cells of the body, and it's going to stimulate cell proliferation. And therefore, it's involved in growth. IGF is critically important in stimulating growth of the tissues, growth of the cells, especially during puberty. And then lastly, we have the ovaries in females and the testes in males. And as you can imagine, these are going to be involved in both sexual development and reproduction. The ovaries are going to produce the sex steroids estrogen and progesterone, which are going to be involved in maturation of the egg. And the testes are going to produce the sex steroid testosterone, and that's going to be important for stimulating sperm production, for stimulating spermatogenesis. All right. So cells that produce hormones are called endocrine cells. So this is an endocrine cell right here that is making hormones. And what's going to happen is that hormone is going to be released from the cell, and it's going to travel into the interstitial fluid and into the blood. And then that hormone is going to travel through the blood. It's going to come back out into the interstitial fluid, and it's going to elicit a physiological effect from a target cell. And my question to you is that once a hormone is in the blood, it has access to nearly every cell of the body. So what is going to determine if a cell is a target cell for that hormone? What's going to make a particular cell bind a hormone and have an effect because of it? What makes a target cell a target cell? And the answer to that is the presence of receptors that are specific for that hormone. So for a cell to be a target cell, it has to have a receptor that is specific for that specific hormone, that binds that specific hormone. And these receptors are extremely complex three-dimensional proteins with different binding sites and whatnot. And so it's a really specific kind of lock and key system. But the point here is that for a cell to be a target cell, it has to have a receptor that is specific for that hormone. And typically, when we have a hormone that travels through the blood and it acts on a distant target cell, that's what we call a traditional endocrine response. That's a traditional endocrine manner of acting. But there's a couple other things that can happen. Another thing that can happen is this endocrine cell can release a hormone into the interstitial fluid. that hormone travels to the interstitial fluid and it binds to and it acts on a neighboring cell. Okay, a cell that's right next to it. It didn't have to go into the bloodstream. And those type of effects, where a hormone acts on a neighboring cell, is called a paracrine effect. Another thing that can happen is this hormone can turn around and it can bind to a receptor on the same cell that released it. And that is called an autocrine effect. So there's lots of different ways that these hormones can get to their target cells. They can travel through the interstitial fluid, or they can travel through the bloodstream and go to a completely different area of the body to act on a target cell. The next thing I want to do is take a moment and compare the endocrine system with the nervous system. And the reason I want to do this is because the endocrine and nervous system are the two major control systems of the body. Okay, these are the two organ systems that are going to control other parts of the body. And let's start with the nervous system. The nervous system is the major control center of the body. Almost all the organ systems are going to be in some form or fashion controlled by the nervous system. Okay. But the nervous and the endocrine system, they work a little bit differently. So what happens with the nervous system is the nervous system starts with the detection of sensory information. So that sensory information can come from outside the body. It can be visual or auditory information. It can detect sensory information within the body, stretch of the stomach, for instance, or blood pressure. Or that sensory information can occur on the surface of the body, on the skin. But in each of those cases, what happens is the nervous system detects that sensory information, and then it travels via sensory neurons toward the central nervous system, toward either the spinal cord or the brain. And in most cases, what's going to happen is that sensory information travels to the spinal cord, then it makes its way up to the brain, and this is where it's integrated. This is where it's processed. And after it's processed, the nervous system decides what response it wants to elicit, what it wants to do about it. So after that's been decided, that information travels back down the brain and the spinal cord, and then that information travels down motor neurons, and those motor neurons stimulate what we call effector organs. They stimulate organs that the nervous system has control over to elicit the response that it wants to elicit. And my question to you is, what are the different organ systems? What are the different effector organs, I should say, that the nervous system has control over? What are the different effector organs or tissue types or cell types that the nervous system has control over? Well, one of those is skeletal muscle. So the nervous system motor neurons can stimulate skeletal muscles to contract, and that produces movement. That produces a response to a particular sensory stimulus. So we have skeletal muscle. What else? Cardiac muscle. So the nervous system can act on cardiac muscle, which we find in the heart, and stimulate that cardiac muscle to do something, to speed up contractions or slow down contractions. Another effector organ is smooth muscle. And where do we find smooth muscle in the body? Well, we find smooth muscle in the hollow tubes of the body. For instance, the digestive tract has a couple layers of smooth muscle. Blood vessels have a layer of smooth muscle. So the nervous system can act on the smooth muscle in these hollow tubes and cause that smooth muscle to contract or relax. And then lastly, the last effector organ for the nervous system is glandular tissue. So the nervous system can act on glands of the body. The salivary glands, for instance, can stimulate saliva secretion by acting on the salivary glands. It can stimulate sweat secretion by acting on sweat glands. And all of these effects, going from sensory stimulus to integration to stimulating an effector organ, this occurs incredibly quickly. This occurs within milliseconds. So this is constantly happening throughout the body. Some stuff we're conscious of, some stuff we're not conscious of, but it's constantly occurring, and it's occurring within milliseconds. And then we have the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is also going to act and have control over different cells of the body. But the endocrine system, I'd say, is maybe a little less structured and a little more diverse in the cells that it can act on. So the endocrine system is made up of all of these different endocrine glands that are scattered throughout the body. And they're all involved in different functions. And what they're going to do is they're going to release hormones. Those hormones are going to travel through the blood, and then they're going to act on target cells and elicit a physiological effect from that target cell. And all it takes for a cell to be a target cell for a hormone is the presence of a receptor for that hormone. So the endocrine system is a little more widespread in that regard than the nervous system. The nervous system can only act on skeletal muscle cells, cardiac muscle cells, smooth muscle cells, and glandular tissue. But hormones from the endocrine system can act on any cell of the body as long as there's a receptor for it. In fact, thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland is going to act on nearly every cell of the body. Almost every cell of the body is going to have a thyroid hormone receptor on it. The same goes for insulin released from the pancreas. Insulin is going to act on nearly every cell of the body. Nearly every cell of the body has an insulin receptor for it. So the endocrine system is a little more widespread and diverse like that. One of the ways that it's different, however, is that the endocrine system, these hormones, take much longer to act, to have a physiological effect than the nervous system, relatively speaking. The nervous system acts within milliseconds. But for hormones to have a physiological effect on a cell, that can take anywhere from seconds to minutes, even up to hours. And in fact, the effects on a cell from a hormone can even last up to days. And so it's a lot slower than the nervous system. And this makes sense because, the endocrine system is regulating more longer term, slower processes like growth and reproduction and metabolism. So I mentioned that there are different ways that you can stimulate the release of hormones from an endocrine gland. And these are those three different ways. These are the three different ways that you can stimulate the release of hormones from a particular endocrine gland. And the first one is what we call a humoral stimulus. And the humors just refer to the fluids of the body. And so a humoral stimulus is when you have levels of ions or nutrients in the fluids of the body that are going to stimulate the release of a hormone. For example, sodium levels or calcium levels in the blood can stimulate the release of a hormone. Glucose levels in the blood can stimulate the release of hormones. Those are all examples of humoral stimuli. And the example they're giving us here is with the parathyroid glands. So this larger gland we have here is the thyroid gland, which wraps around the trachea. But on the posterior side, on the back of the thyroid gland, we have these four nodules called the parathyroid glands. And these parathyroid glands are sensitive to blood calcium levels. And specifically, in response to low blood calcium, they're going to release the hormone, parathyroid hormone, into the blood. So this is an example of a humoral stimulus where the parathyroid glands are responding to low blood calcium and they're releasing parathyroid hormone in response. And then parathyroid hormone is going to travel through the blood, act on target cells with the intention of bringing that blood calcium level back up to where it needs to be. The next type of stimulus is a neural stimulus. So the nervous system can act on endocrine glands and cause the release of hormones. And the example that they're giving us here is the adrenal gland. And specifically, the inner portion of the adrenal gland, which we call the adrenal medulla. Medulla just means middle portion. And the adrenal medulla is under the control of the sympathetic nervous system. So you can see that you have sympathetic nerve fibers which travel down and they innervate the adrenal medulla. So what do you think of with the sympathetic nervous system? What comes to mind? Well, the sympathetic nervous system is in charge of the fight or flight response. And so the sympathetic nervous system is going to be activated during periods of excitement, exercise, anxiety. And these sympathetic neurons are going to be activated and they're going to act on the adrenal medulla and they're going to stimulate the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood, the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine. So this is an example of a neural stimulus. And then these hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine, are going to travel through the blood and act on target cells to facilitate the fight or flight response. For instance, they can act on the heart and cause the heart to contract more forcefully. They can act on the lungs and cause bronchodilation of the lungs. And so you're able to breathe more. And the last type of stimulus is a hormonal stimulus. So this is where a hormone can act on an endocrine gland and cause that endocrine gland to release its own hormone. And the examples they're giving us here are the thyroid gland, the adrenal gland, except now we're talking about the outer edge of the adrenal gland. This is the adrenal cortex. Cortex just means outer layer, kind of the bark layer. And then also the gonads, both the testes and the ovaries. So all three of these endocrine glands are going to release their own hormones, and they're going to do so in response to hormonal stimuli. Now, what all of these three endocrine glands have in common is that they're part of what we call an endocrine axis. They're part of a larger endocrine axis. And this endocrine axis involves the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and then what we call these downstream endocrine organs. And what's going to happen is the hypothalamus is up in the brain. And so it's receiving all of this sensory information. And in response to certain sensory information, the hypothalamus is going to release hormones into the blood. And those hormones are going to travel down to the anterior pituitary. In response, the anterior pituitary is going to release their own hormones into the blood. And some of those hormones, depending on what they are, can act on the thyroid gland and cause the thyroid gland to release its own hormone, thyroid hormone, into the blood. So this is an example of a hormonal stimulus where you have hormones acting on the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland releases its own hormone in response. The same goes for the adrenal cortex. Depending on what the hormones released from the anterior pituitary are, some of those hormones can travel down, act on the adrenal cortex, and cause the adrenal cortex to release its own hormones into the blood. Cortisol and aldosterone are examples of hormones that the cortex is going to release into the blood. And the same goes for the gonads, for the ovaries and the testes. If the right hormones are released by the anterior pituitary, then they can act on the testes and cause the testes to release testosterone. They can act on the ovaries and cause the ovaries to release estrogen and progesterone. So again, an example of a hormonal stimulus. Now I want to take a look at some of these examples in a little more detail. And I want to start with some different examples of humoral stimuli. So levels of ions or nutrients in the fluids of the body resulting in hormone release. And this is the example that we looked at just on the prior slide. Here we have this is a posterior view of the neck. And embedded on the back of the thyroid gland are the parathyroid glands. And the parathyroid glands are going to respond to low blood calcium. Hypo means low. So they're going to respond to hypocalcemia, low levels of calcium in the blood. And in response, they're going to release the hormone, parathyroid hormone, into the blood. So that's an example of a humoral stimulus. But what's parathyroid hormone going to do? The goal of parathyroid hormone is to increase calcium in the blood. And there's a few ways that they're going to do that. One is they're going to act on the bones of the body. And something to know about the bones of the body is that the bones have a reserve of calcium and phosphate that are made just for this purpose, that are made to be released into the blood to regulate these blood calcium levels. And the cells that we're going to find, the cells that are responsible for breaking down that calcium extracellular matrix and releasing those into the blood are called osteoclasts. And so parathyroid hormone is going to stimulate the activity of these osteoclasts. These osteoclasts are going to break down this calcium and phosphate reserve, and they're going to release it into the blood. And so that's going to help increase blood calcium. Another thing that parathyroid hormone is going to do is it's going to act on the kidneys. So it's the job of the kidneys to filter blood, to take fluid from the blood And then anything that needs to be returned to the blood to maintain blood chemistry, it does. But anything that needs to be removed from the blood, the kidney eliminates that from the body is urine. And so parathyroid hormone is going to act on the kidney, and it's going to increase the amount of calcium that the kidney returns to the blood. So the kidney filters out calcium, and then the kidney has a choice to release some of that into the urine or reabsorb that into the blood. And parathyroid hormone is going to cause the kidney to reabsorb that back into the blood. So that's going to help increase blood calcium. And the last thing that parathyroid hormone is going to do is it's going to activate the kidney. It's going to act on the kidney again, and it's going to stimulate the activation of vitamin D. Vitamin D is a steroid hormone that's actually produced. There's 3 organs that are required to produce vitamin D. It requires the skin, it requires the liver, and it also requires the kidney. And to make the final form of vitamin D, that requires enzymes in the kidney. And so parathyroid hormone is going to act on the kidney, and it's going to activate vitamin D. It's going to increase the amount of vitamin D circulating around in the blood. And this is important because vitamin D is responsible for taking calcium in the intestine and moving it into the blood. It's responsible for calcium absorption in the gut. So if we increase the amount of vitamin D, we increase the amount of calcium absorption from the small intestine, and that's going to increase blood calcium. So all 3 of these, parathyroid hormone is working in all 3 of these ways to increase blood calcium. And again, this all started with a humoral stimulus, with hypocalcemia. The pancreas is another example of an endocrine organ that is stimulated by a humoral stimulus. And specifically, the pancreas is going to release hormones in response to blood sugar. So blood sugar, like blood calcium, is something we maintain homeostasis over. We need that to stay within tight limits within the blood. And if blood sugar gets too high or too low, then that's something we need to correct for. So what if blood sugar gets too high? Well, that's something we need to bring back down to normal. When might your blood sugar get too high? When might you have hyperglycemia? Well, after eating a meal, for instance. And the way that the body is going to correct for this is the pancreas. And it's the pancreas that is going to detect these high blood sugar levels, this hyperglycemia. So that's a humoral stimulus. And in response, the pancreas is going to release the hormone insulin into the blood. What's insulin going to do? Well, insulin is going to act on most of the cells of the body. Most of the cells of the body are target cells for insulin, and it's going to cause those cells to take glucose from the blood and move it into the cell. And so that by itself is decreasing blood sugar. It's taking glucose in the blood and moving it into the cells. Now, what are these cells going to do with it? They're going to use it to make ATP. They're going to convert glucose to ATP by a process called cellular respiration. Another thing insulin is going to do is it's going to act on the liver, and it's going to cause the liver to take this excess glucose and convert it to a storage form called glycogen. Glycogen is basically a polymer a branched polymer of individual glucose units. So we have all of this extra sugar in the blood, and we don't want it to go to waste, so we want to store it for later. So insulin is going to act on the liver and tell the liver to take these individual glucose units and link them together by chemical bonds and convert them into a storage form, which is glycogen. And that's another way that we're going to decrease blood sugar. Both of these mechanisms are going to cause blood glucose to fall back down into their normal range. And again, this started with a humoral stimulus, the pancreas detecting high blood sugar and releasing insulin in response to that. What about when our blood sugar gets too low? This is hypoglycemia. And when might this occur? Well, maybe you haven't eaten for 8 hours, 10 hours. What about when you're sleeping? Your blood sugar is going to fall. And this is something that needs to be corrected. You need a constant level of sugar in the blood so the cells have a constant source of glucose to convert to ATP. And the nervous system is especially sensitive to this. The brain is highly glucose dependent. We need constant levels of glucose in the blood, especially for the brain. And if blood sugar falls too low, you might feel these effects in your central nervous system. Maybe you get dizzy, maybe you get confused, you can't think as well, maybe your mood changes, you get angry. That's all because blood sugar fell. So this low blood sugar, this hypoglycemia, is going to be detected by the pancreas. And in response, the pancreas is going to release a hormone called glucagon. And it's the job of glucagon to raise blood sugar. Well, how's it going to do that? Well, it's going to act on the liver, and it's going to take this glycogen that we made during times of high blood sugar, and it's going to cause the liver to take individual glucose units and break them off of that glycogen and then move that glucose into the blood. So it's causing the breakdown of glycogen into individual glucose units and causing that glucose to be shipped out into the blood. And that's going to raise blood sugar. And again, this is a good example of a humoral stimulus where low blood sugar stimulates the release of glucagon from the pancreas. And the last example of a humoral stimulus I want to look at is by endocrine cells in the small intestine. So let's go ahead and orient ourselves here. Here we have the stomach. So the stomach receives food from the esophagus, and food is going to be in the stomach for 2 to 4 hours. And it's going to be mixing around there with gastric juice, and it's going to be converted into this paste that we call chyme. And then as it becomes more paste-like, small amounts of that chyme are going to make their way through the pyloric sphincter and into the first part of the small intestine, which is the duodenum. And that's where we're looking at here. This is the duodenum. And the small intestine, the duodenum, is lined by epithelial cells. And some of those epithelial cells are endocrine cells. They can produce hormones. And these are them that are being represented on the figure. And we call these enteroendocrine cells. Entero refers to the intestine, and endocrine just means that they have the potential to produce hormones. And so these enteroendocrine cells are going to respond to the presence of proteins and fats in chyme, in the fluid that's moving through the small intestine. And in response, they're going to produce a hormone, release a hormone called cholecystokinin, abbreviated CCK. And so this is another good example of a humoral stimulus, where you have endocrine cells that are responding to the presence of nutrient levels, proteins and fats in fluids of the body. In this case, in the chyme that's going through the small intestine. And in response, they release cholecystokinin into the blood. Now, what's this CCK going to do in response? Well, that cholecystokinin is going to go through the blood and it's going to act back on the pancreas. And one of the main things that it's going to do is it's going to stimulate the release of pancreatic juice by the pancreas. So it's going to stimulate the pancreas to produce pancreatic juice. Put this in a different color. And that pancreatic juice is going to travel down the pancreatic duct into the small intestine. And why is this important? How does this match up? Well, pancreatic juice is going to contain all sorts of digestive enzymes, including proteases that are going to break down proteins and lipases that break down fats. A different color here. So pancreatic juice, CCK stimulates the release of pancreatic juice, which contains digestive enzymes. So this makes sense, right? We have proteins and fats in the small intestine, which means that it's time to release enzymes to start breaking those down. And that's exactly what these enteroendocrine cells are doing through the release of CCK. Another thing that CCK does is it's going to go through the blood and it's going to act on the gallbladder and it's going to cause contraction of the gallbladder. And how is that significant? Well, the gallbladder is where bile is stored. And so that's going to cause bile to move down the bile duct and also be released into the duodenum. And as you know, it's the job of bile to take lipid droplets and break them down into smaller lipid droplets to emulsify them. And basically what that does is it increases the surface area so we have more efficient digestion by the lipases. But again, the take-home message here is that this is an example of a humoral stimulus where we have proteins and fats in the small intestine stimulating the release of CCK from these enteroendocrine cells. And then the CCK does, just what we think it'd do. It acts on target cells to increase the efficiency of digestion of those proteins and fats. Then we have nervous system stimulation, and this is the same example that we looked at before. And this represents sympathetic nervous system stimulation of the adrenal medulla, of this middle portion of the adrenal gland. And again, this is going to occur during the fight or flight response. During fight or flight, we're activating sympathetic neurons. These are all the sympathetic neurons here, which originate from the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. And then those sympathetic neurons go out and they reach all of these different target cells. They're going to act on the heart and increase heart rate. They're going to act on the lungs and cause bronchodilation of the lungs. They're going to decrease activity of digestive organs because that's just not a priority during the fight or flight response. But what you can also see is that these sympathetic neurons are going to act on the adrenal gland. And specifically, they're acting on the adrenal medulla to cause the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. So a nervous system stimulus of hormones. And then that epinephrine and norepinephrine is going to go into the blood and act on target organs, effector organs, to facilitate the fight or flight response. And like I mentioned earlier, it's going to act on the lungs and cause bronchodilation of the lungs, so you increase your pulmonary ventilation. It's going to act on cells and increase metabolic rate. It's actually going to act on the liver and cause the release of glucose into the blood to raise your blood sugar. So again, a good example of a nervous system stimulus. Another good example of nervous system stimulation of an endocrine gland is the release of melatonin by the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is going to release the hormone melatonin, and it's going to do so in response to nervous system stimulation. Well, how does that occur? Well, maybe you know that melatonin, and this is shown down below, melatonin is released in response to darkness. These are melatonin levels on the y-axis, and you can see during the day our melatonin levels are low, but that at night they go up. And then as it becomes light out, they go down, and this cycle repeats itself every day, during the day and at night. And it's this melatonin that's released at night that's going to help with our sleep cycles. It's involved in our circadian rhythms, our 24-hour cycles, our sleep-wake cycles. But how is this melatonin released, or how does the body know, how does the pineal gland know to release melatonin during periods of darkness? Well, this involves the nervous system. What part of the nervous system is going to detect periods of darkness? That's the job of the eyes. So the eyes are going to detect this visual information, this lack of light, this darkness. And that sensory information is going to be taken to the brain by this nerve right here, which is the optic nerve, cranial nerve 2. So this is all nervous system involvement. And that information is going to be taken to the hypothalamus, specifically this area of the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And from there, the hypothalamus sends it down to this region of the spinal cord in the cervical region, this area called the superior cervical ganglion. And then that information is sent back up the spinal cord through the brainstem to the pineal gland. And that information going to the pineal gland is going to stimulate the pineal gland to produce melatonin. So this is all nervous system stimulation all the way, starting with the eyes, traveling through the optic nerve to the hypothalamus, down to the cervical region of the spinal cord, and back up to the pineal gland. This is the nervous system sending this information about darkness to the pineal gland and telling it to produce melatonin in response. And then lastly, we have hormonal stimuli. Hormones acting on other endocrine glands and causing those glands to release their own hormones. And these are examples we looked at previously. We'll just take a little closer look at it. Here we have the thyroid gland. And here we have the adrenal gland, specifically the adrenal cortex, this outer layer of the adrenal gland. Both of these endocrine glands are going to release their own hormones in response to hormonal stimuli. And as I mentioned earlier, both of these glands are part of a larger endocrine axis that involves the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and then the downstream endocrine organ. And what's going to happen is the hypothalamus is going to release hormones into the blood, in this case a hormone called TRH. TRH is going to act on the anterior pituitary, and in response the anterior pituitary is going to release a hormone called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Then TSH is going to act on the thyroid gland and cause the release of thyroid hormone. So the thyroid gland is releasing thyroid hormone in response to a hormonal stimulus. And this is part of this larger axis. It's called the hypothalamo-pituitary thyroid axis. And we'll get into this more detail coming up. And then the same goes for the adrenal gland, the adrenal cortex. This is part of the hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis. And in this case, the hypothalamus is going to release a hormone called CRH. CRH is going to act on the anterior pituitary and cause the release of ACTH into the blood. Then ACTH is going to act on the adrenal cortex and cause the adrenal cortex to release the hormones cortisol and aldosterone into the blood. So again, an example of a hormonal stimulus. And the last thing I want to talk about are the different chemical structures of hormones, the different molecules that hormones can be made of. And there's 3 categories of chemical structures that hormones can be made of. And one of those are peptide hormones, or also called protein hormones. And what these are hormones made up of chains of amino acids anywhere from 3 to 200 amino acids in length. So these are peptide hormones or protein hormones. And this is the primary structure of one of those hormones, ACTH, which is produced in the anterior pituitary. And each one of these little guys is an individual amino acid. So it's a string of amino acids. And this is showing this protein in its primary or its linear structure, but in reality, it's folded back on itself into a complicated 3-dimensional structure. So what are some other examples of protein hormones? Well, insulin and glucagon are protein hormones. These are both produced by the pancreas. Growth hormone, produced by the anterior pituitary, is also a protein hormone. The second chemical classification of hormones are amine hormones. And these hormones are modified amino acids that retain an amino group. And this is the amino group down there. So it's a modified amino acid and it retains an amino group on it. And the example they're giving here is thyroxine, which is T4. It's the T4 version of thyroid hormone, also called tetraiodothyronine. Tetra meaning 4, iodo meaning 4 iodines. And as you can see, there are 4 iodine molecules on this T4 molecule. Other examples of amine hormones. Well, we have thyroid hormone, and this includes both T4 and T3. Melatonin from the pineal gland is an amine hormone. Also, epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla are amine hormones. And the last chemical classification of hormones are steroid hormones. And steroid hormones are lipid hormones derived from cholesterol. All steroids are derived from a cholesterol molecule, and they're lipid soluble. And the example that they're giving here is estradiol. But some other examples include testosterone. Estradiol is just another term for estrogen. Progesterone from the ovaries. Cortisol and aldosterone from the adrenal cortex are steroid hormones. And these steroid hormones are characterized by these ring structures. There's a 4-ring structure. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So when you see 4 rings put together like that, 4 carbon rings put together like that, then you should think steroid hormone. So let's take a look at some examples of each of these types of chemical classifications of hormones. And we'll start with protein hormones. And a good place to look for protein hormones is in the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. And as I mentioned earlier, the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary is in an endocrine relationship with all of these downstream endocrine organs. And they form these endocrine axes that start from the hypothalamus and make their way down to these downstream endocrine organs. So the hypothalamus is going to release a set of hormones onto the anterior pituitary. And these are them. Those are the potential hormones the hypothalamus can release onto the anterior pituitary. And all of those are protein hormones. TRH, GnRH, CRH, and GHRH are all protein hormones. And then, depending on what hormone is released on the anterior pituitary can release its own hormones. Prolactin, which is going to act on the mammary glands and stimulate milk letdown. TSH, which is going to act on the thyroid gland and stimulate thyroid hormone release. Growth hormone is going to act on the liver and stimulate IGF release. ACTH is going to act on the adrenal cortex and cause the release of cortisol and aldosterone. And LH and FSH are going to act on the testes and the ovaries to cause the release of gonadal sex steroids, testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. And all of these anterior pituitary hormones are also protein hormones. So they're all protein hormones. And right here, get a different color. Right there, we're looking at the structure of growth hormone. So here we have growth hormone that's produced by the anterior pituitary. And this is the secondary structure of it. And you can see it's made up of all of these different amino acids that are linked together by covalent bonds. So it's a string of amino acids. But in reality, what happens, and this is the case with all of these protein hormones, is that the side chains on the amino acids interact with each other and they end up forming these complex 3-dimensional shapes. And different parts of this shape are involved in different things. Like, for instance, this little groove right there may be involved in binding the growth hormone receptor. So it's all 3-dimensional and it's very complex structure-wise. When it comes to steroid hormones, there's 2 main places in the body to find steroid hormones. One is in the adrenal glands, and the other is in the gonads, the testes and the ovaries. So let's start with the adrenal gland. And there's 2 adrenal glands, one on top of each kidney. And like I mentioned earlier, there's an inner region called the adrenal medulla. And the adrenal medulla is going to be under the control of the sympathetic nervous system. And when stimulated, it's going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood as part of the fight or flight response. But the adrenal cortex, this outer layer, is going to be responsible. It's going to be part of an endocrine axis with the hypothalamus in the anterior pituitary, and it's going to produce steroid hormones. And there's 3 different steroid hormones that are produced. We have cortisol is one of the primary adrenal steroids that is released. And this has a role in the stress response. This has a role with long-term stress. There's also a small amount of androgens that are produced by the adrenal gland. And androgens are masculinizing hormones. And there's not necessarily a lot of testosterone produced by the adrenal cortex, but there's other less active androgens like DHEA, for instance. But it's not the adrenal gland's primary role to produce these androgens. As far as adrenal steroids, the primary role is to produce cortisol. And another important steroid it's going to produce is aldosterone. And aldosterone is going to be responsible for regulating sodium balance in the blood. And it has a direct impact on blood pressure. And it's also going to be a part of the long-term stress response. So both aldosterone and cortisol are going to be part of the long-term stress response. And then the other good place to find steroid hormones are in the gonads and the testes and the ovaries. And here we're looking at the ovaries. And the ovaries are also part of a hypothalamus anterior pituitary axis. We call that the hypothalamo-pituitary ovarian axis in this case. And the hypothalamus is going to release the protein hormone GnRH. The anterior pituitary is going to release the protein hormones LH and FSH. And those are going to act on the ovaries. And in response, the ovaries are going to produce the gonadal steroids, estrogen, and progesterone. And those are going to have important roles in the ovarian cycle, the maturation of the egg, and also the menstrual cycle. And then if we were to replace the ovaries with the testes, we would have the same hormones produced by the hypothalamus. We'd have GnRH produced by the hypothalamus, LH and FSH produced by the anterior pituitary, but then those would act on the testes, and the testes would produce testosterone in response, which is another gonadal steroid. And testosterone is responsible for stimulating sperm production, stimulating spermatogenesis. And something interesting about these steroid hormones is that they're all derived from cholesterol. They're all derived from this cholesterol molecule. And what happens is they get converted from one steroid hormone to the next by different enzymes. So there's different enzymes in the adrenal glands and the gonads that are going to take a cholesterol molecule and convert it to the final steroid product that is intended. So for instance, to get to cortisol, let's say we're in the adrenal cortex and we want cortisol as the hormone we're going to release. Well, what happens is the adrenal gland has to take cholesterol and it converts it to this precursor called pregnenolone, and then another enzyme converts it to cortisol. And you can see that the ring structure is the same. We have this 4-carbon ring structure, and what changes are these side chains of it. Enzymes are taking side chains off, adding stuff onto it, and that makes it into a different molecule. Aldosterone. If we want to get to aldosterone, we have to take cholesterol, convert it to pregnenolone. That gets converted to progesterone, and then that gets converted to aldosterone. Something else that's really interesting is that to get to estrogen, to get to estradiol, we first have to go through testosterone. So all estradiol is formed from testosterone. And there's an enzyme called P450 aromatase that converts testosterone to estradiol. And as you can imagine, this aromatase enzyme is highly active in the ovaries because the ovaries don't want to produce testosterone. They want to produce estradiol, estrogen. And so aromatase in the ovaries is going to take testosterone and convert it to estradiol. And there are genetic deficiencies where genetic females don't have, or they have a low level of aromatase. And so instead of converting that testosterone to estrogen, you end up with an accumulation of testosterone. And if that happens, well, that depends when that happens during development or maturity, but that can lead to masculinizing effects, even though they are a genetic XX female. And then lastly, we have amine hormones. And amine hormones are modified amino acids that maintain an amino group. So let's take a look at a few of these. Both forms of thyroid hormone, T4 and T3, are both amine hormones. And in each case, these are double tyrosine amino acids. So there are two tyrosine amino acids linked together, and then they have iodine molecules attached to them. T4 has 4 iodine molecules attached to it. T3 has 3 iodine molecules attached to it. So both T4 and T3 are amine hormones. Melatonin, produced by the pineal gland, is an amine hormone. This is a modified L-tryptophan amino acid. And then lastly, both norepinephrine and epinephrine are amine hormones. These are modified L-tyrosine amino acids that go through this conversion process and eventually get converted to norepinephrine or epinephrine. And also, while we're here, part of this conversion process is converting that L-tyrosine amino acid to dopamine. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's released by neurons up in the brain. It's a feel-good neurotransmitter, also an amine. And the last thing I want to do is to look at these different types of hormones and just give you an idea of how they act on a cell and have an effect, a physiological effect on that cell. And chemical classification has a lot to do with that. So we'll start by looking at the action of peptide or protein hormones. And the key thing to understand about protein hormones is that they are lipophobic. They're lipid fearing. Okay, so keep that in mind. So here we have a protein hormone. They're just calling it a non-steroid hormone here, but this is a protein hormone that's traveling around in the blood. And when that protein hormone gets to its target tissue, it's going to leave the capillary and move into the interstitial fluid. Now, because that protein hormone is lipophobic, it is not able to diffuse through the plasma membrane directly. Instead, it has to bind to a receptor that's located on the plasma membrane. So this protein hormone binds to its receptor on the plasma membrane. And again, the reason the receptor is located on the plasma membrane is because the protein hormone cannot diffuse into the cell on its own. Now, once that hormone binds to its receptor on the plasma membrane, it instigates or it causes a whole series of intracellular events that are collectively called a signal transduction pathway. And the net effect of this signal transduction pathway is some sort of cellular change, whatever that protein hormone, whatever effect that's going to have on the cell, whatever physiological effect. And these signal transduction pathways can be extremely complicated. Like in this instance, the hormone binds to the receptor, that activates the receptor, and the receptor activates what we call a G protein. This G protein located in the plasma membrane. Then this G protein activates another molecule located on the plasma membrane called adenylate cyclase. And adenylate cyclase, that's an enzyme that's going to convert ATP to this molecule called cyclic AMP. And cyclic AMP is what we call a second messenger. At that point, what color should I use? At that point, that second messenger, in this case, is going to take this inactive protein and it's going to activate it. It's going to activate this protein, this enzyme called protein kinase. And then what this protein kinase is going to do is it's going to take a protein and it's going to add a phosphate molecule onto it. It's going to phosphorylate it. So here we have a phosphorylated protein. And essentially what you're doing there is you're energizing that protein. By putting that phosphate on there, you're giving it chemical energy that it can use to do work. And so that phosphorylated protein has energy, and at that point, it can do whatever it does that's going to lead to a cellular change. It's going to release that phosphate, which is going to give it the energy to cause some cellular change. And again, these signal transduction pathways can be extremely complicated, and we don't necessarily need to know the details, but in general, that's how these protein hormones are working. Binding to a receptor on the plasma membrane and stimulating this signal transduction pathway that leads to a cellular change. Now, this mechanism of action is in contrast to steroid hormones. And the key with steroid hormones, because they're derived from cholesterol, they are lipophilic. They're lipid loving. And so basically what that means is here you have a steroid hormone that's traveling around in the blood and it gets dropped off at its target cell. But because it's lipophilic, it can diffuse right through the plasma membrane into the cell. Okay, it doesn't need a plasma membrane receptor. Then what happens most of the time, oftentimes, is it's going to make its way into the nucleus, and that's where it's going to bind to its hormone receptor, is in the nucleus. There's its hormone receptor. So now you have this hormone receptor complex inside the nucleus. And at this point, what it's going to do is it's going to bind to another receptor that's located on the DNA. So this hormone receptor complex binds to another receptor on the DNA. And why would we want to do that? What does DNA do? Well, DNA contains the instructions to build proteins. So by binding to the DNA, we're going to stimulate gene transcription of a particular protein. We're going to make a new protein. And then that new protein is going to have whatever effect it's going to have either within the cell, or it can be shipped out of the cell and have an effect on something further away. But the goal here is to make a new protein and then have that new protein carry out whatever physiological effect it's going to carry out. And that's what this figure is showing. So the hormone receptor complex binds to the receptor on the DNA, and then we undergo gene expression. We make an mRNA copy of the gene. That mRNA copy goes out into the cytoplasm, and it gets converted to a protein. And then again, that protein is going to have whatever effect it's going to have. So two different ways that these hormones are acting. And I will say that with regards to amine hormones, thyroid hormone is going to act the same way. Thyroid hormone is going to diffuse into the cell and bind to a receptor in the nucleus. And then one last thing I want to point out is that even though this is the classic way that steroid hormones work, they are finding that there are also steroid hormone receptors located on the plasma membrane. So it's another possibility for steroid hormones to bind to a receptor on the plasma membrane and then go through a big signal transduction pathway and phosphorylate a protein to lead to an effect that way. And for instance, progesterone has been shown to have a receptor on the plasma membrane. Cortisol has been shown to have an effect on the plasma membrane, to have a receptor on the plasma membrane. And you may say, well, why is that necessary? Why is that the case? And the answer I would have for that is that to go through the genome to make a new protein, this typically takes minutes to hours to make a new protein. So, it takes a little while. But when you go up and you work through a signal transduction pathway, this takes much less time. This can take seconds. And so it's a much faster mechanism of action. And so if steroid hormones want to have a faster effect, then they can bind to receptors on the plasma membrane. Okay, good deal.